In Lesson 8.6, we're going to take a look at square roots in a rational number. So a perfect square is a number that is the product of two equal numbers. So for example, like 25 is 5 times 5. So that's a perfect square. 36 is 6 times 6. What's another one? 49 is 7 times 7. Okay, so these 25, 36, 49, and there's a ton others, those are all perfect squares. Because there's a number that when you multiply it by itself, you get that as your answer. So finding the square root is just figuring out what number, number sign, multiplied by itself gives you the original number. Okay, so an example, if I were to ask you what's the square root of 81, and that's a square root symbol, it looks like a division, but it's got a little extra check mark on it. What number times itself gives me 81? Well, it would be 9. Okay, so 9 would be the square root. You don't list it twice. You just say 9 is the square root of 81. And an irrational number is a number that can't be written as a fraction. So it has a really ugly decimal square root. Okay, so for an example, if I were to ask you for the square root of 5, there's no number that when you multiply it by 5 by itself gives you 5 as an answer, so this is irrational. You'll get a really gross decimal if you tried to punch that in. 5 is not irrational, but the square root of 5 is irrational. Okay, so pause the video and fill that in before moving on. Okay, so now in the first example, I don't really know what they want us to do with this grid, but this symbol says, what's the square root of 121? So what number times itself gives us 121? Well, since 11 squared, 11 times 11 is 121, that means the square root of 121 must be 11. Okay, so we can ignore this. Let me scroll down. Okay, so now we're going to estimate square roots. So a square rug has an area of 68 feet squared. Use the formula for area of a square to estimate the dimensions of the rug. So we know that area of a square, or area of a rectangle, is base times height, but in a square they're going to be the same. So it's side times side, or side squared. I know that the area is 68, so I'm going to put that in for A. Now to figure out what number when I square it gives me 68, I'm going to square root both sides. Now square root of 68 isn't nice, so we're not going to bother with that, but I want to find perfect squares close to 68. So let's talk about for a second, and I want you to copy this table down. So square root and perfect square. So 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 times 4 is 16, 5 times 5 is 25, 6 times 6 is 36. 7 times 7 is 49. 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 9 is 81. 10 times 10 is 100. 11 times 11 is 121. And 12 times 12 is 144. Okay, so 68 over here falls between these two numbers. So square root of 68 is going to be between the square root of 64 and the square root of 81. Well, square root of 64 is 8. The square root of 81 is 9, so that means that my answer is going to be between 8 and 9. Now 68 is much closer to 64 than 81, so we'll say that the square root of 68 is about 8, because it's closer to the 8. So the dimensions of the rug are about 8 feet by 8 feet. Okay, we're estimating. So I know that 8 times 8 is not 68, but it's really close to 68, so we're using the nicer numbers. Let's pause the video and make sure you copy this table down. Okay, that's important. I'm going to expect you to know those, so make sure you write those down. Okay, in the last part here, you're going to classify some numbers. You're going to identify each number as rational or irrational. So, rational will be if this square root is nice, and irrational will be if the square root is bad. So, 121, is that a perfect square or is not? It is a perfect square. So, since that equals 11, I'm going to say rational. 30, however, is not a perfect square. It was not in that chart that we just wrote down. So that's going to be like 5 point something. It's going to be gross. So we're going to say irrational. 20.5167. Now it's a terminating decimal. And if it terminates, meaning it ends, see how this has dot, dot, dot? That means it doesn't end. If it terminates, you can actually write it as a fraction. So we're going to call that rational. And this one, 299, 2999, it's a different pattern. It's not the same pattern, and it doesn't end. So this is going to be irrational. Okay, so now you try the quick checks. Quick check 1, you're just going to find the square root of each of those numbers. Quick check 2 is just like the area of the rug. You want to figure out what are the dimensions. You want to estimate the dimensions of the floor. And quick check 3, you're just going to say if those numbers are rational or irrational. So try the quick checks and we'll check your work in class.